In 2013, a man sitting in Ohio State court was declared dead by Judge Alan Davis. Let me repeat, he wasn't given a life sentence or sentenced to death. He was declared dead. Donald Eugene Miller Jr. was sitting before the judge making the case that he was not deceased, offering as evidence his breath, his good health, and his physical presence. And yet the judge went on, despite the fairly compelling proof of life, to declare him dead. And the reason for this is an oddity of Ohio state law, because according to the Ohio Revised Code, section 2121.01, if a person disappeared and hadn't been heard from in 5 years, or disappeared less than 5 years ago after being exposed to a specific peril, they can legally be presumed dead. And an interested party, like an heir or beneficiary, can bring an action asking a court to declare the missing person deceased in order to distribute their assets or property. And it turns out that Donald Miller had last been seen in his hometown in 1986. And in 1994, his ex-wife petitioned the court to declare him dead so that his children could get Social Security death benefits. And it so happens that it was, in fact, the very same judge, Alan Davis, who had overseen and granted that petition. So 19 years later, when Miller came before the judge and asked to be declared legally alive, he did so that he could get his Social Security and driver's license back. Unfortunately for him, the Ohio law only allows for a death decree to be vacated within 3 years of having been declared. So legally, Miller was deceased and remained so. The judge concluded his ruling on the case by simply saying, "I don't know where this leaves you, but you are still deceased as far as the law is concerned." Now, the 17th century English clergyman Thomas Fuller is credited with the English idiom that seeing is believing. And that truism is precisely what makes the case of Miller so stunning, because despite his 19-year disappearance and the presumption of death, we all assume that him sitting and speaking and breathing in court should persuade the law that he is, in fact, alive. Of course, had he not been sitting in court and all the judge had to consider was a report of a sighting, we would be deeply suspicious and consider the case both tenuous and dubious and be more than happy to remain unconvinced that he was alive. That is why it takes 5 years for Harry Potter to convince the wizarding world that the villain Voldemort had returned. Having been thought dead for more than a decade, it took the public actually seeing him for them to believe that he was back. That is why it takes Helen Hunt seeing Tom Hanks in the movie Castaway to believe that after years presumed dead, he is still alive. That is the premise of the recent television series Manifest, where a plane full of passengers mysteriously skips 5 years on from Jamaica to JFK, and their arrival stuns their relatives and friends. And that is where we stood this morning as we read of Yaakov receiving the news of his son's survival. 10 brothers all clamor around their father and try to convince him that Yosef is still alive. Having been told more than 19 years ago by the very same brothers that Yosef's bloodstained coat incontrovertibly attested to his demise, Yaakov remains skeptical and cynical and implies that the brothers can do nothing to persuade him. V'yagidu lo lemor, they said to him, Od Yosef chai, Joseph still lives. V'chihu moshel b'chol eretz Mitzrayim, and he rules over the entirety of Egypt. V'yafag libo, but Yaakov's heart was numb, kilo hamin lahem, because he did not believe them. V'yidabru elav et kol divrei Yosef asher diber aleihem, they told him everything that Yosef had told them, but still nothing. And then something inexplicable happens. Yaakov sees something that persuades him to change his mind and entertain the possibility that his son is still alive. And what does he see? V'yared ha'agalot asher shalach Yosef. He saw the wagons that Yosef had sent, and suddenly we're told that his spirit was revived and he devised a plan to go and see his son. Vayoma Yisrael, and Israel said, Rav, Od Yosef b'nichai, this is great, Yosef is still alive. Elcha ve'erenu b'terem amut, let me go and see him before I die. And this is my question. What on earth changed Yaakov's mind? If seeing is believing and disbelief is beyond reasonable without proof, what was it about the wagons that moved the needle for Yaakov and convinced him that the news that he was hearing was true. What about these wagons implied that Yosef was still alive and motivated his father to try and find him? In the words of the Moroccan-born rabbinic mystic Reb Chaim ibn Attar, the Or HaChaim, Ma davar chadash ra'ah. What did he see that was new? And there are three streams of thought that seek to answer this question. The first view is that Yaakov understood the wagons to serve as a secret code that only Yosef could have possibly known. Most famously, Rashi forwards this view, citing a midrashic tradition that during their last conversation, Yaakov and Yosef had been discussing the subject of the Egla Arufah, the sober ceremony performed in the wake of an unsolved murder. And 19 years later, Yaakov understood that the Agalot were a subtle phonetic reference to the Egla Arufah, reminding Yaakov of his final conversation with his long-lost son. A long-standing mystical tradition differs from the Midrash and suggests that actually the final conversation between Yaakov and Yosef was not about the Egla Arufah, but the wagons used for the inauguration of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the Agalot Tzav. But whether the reference was to a civic ceremony or ritual one, for a whole range of commentators, Yosef wove a secret code into his brother's procession through the desert, and as soon as Yaakov saw the wagons, he knew that it was true, that Yosef was still alive. But for a second cluster of exegetes, this view is near impossible to maintain. For Yosef to employ this code and for Yaakov to decipher it would require both of them to be gifted with both impeccable recall and fluency with biblical laws only taught in the future. So for them, the wagons changed Yaakov's mind not because they represented a secret cipher, but on the contrary, they made the brothers' case obvious for all to see. In the words of the Spanish diplomat Don Isaac Abravanel, Bisman hahu ha'agalot miyuchadot lamelech. In those days, wagons were reserved for the emperor. Lo haya adam rashai lishamesh behem bli reshuto, and no one could use them without the emperor's permission. So having heard the brothers describe Yosef's rise to power and outline his plans for his father, the wagons were the final proof required. His sons had returned from Egypt with the seal of the king. How else could 10 Canaanites explain their custody of a royal train of wagons unless their brother had the power to permit it? So now for the Abravanel and a whole host of others, the preponderance of evidence reinforced the story that Yaakov was hearing. But to the Abravanel, many have objected that the presence of royal wagons would by no means prove that the brothers' tale was true. Back then, the wilderness was a wild place filled with pirates, raiders, and thieves. So the idea that a responsible treasurer of the Egyptian economy would afford international traders an escort would not be that difficult to believe. In the words of the Kliyakar, Shema Moshela Aretz, maybe the ruler of the land, Aser Halavaya Lehem, gave them security and escort, Mitzachu Davasha Seichel Mechayab, because it is a logical thing to do. In many ways, it remains more plausible for a self-interested pharaoh to offer protection to foreign traders than for Yaakov's long-lost son to still be alive 19 years later. So the idea that Yaakov, skeptical and cynical about the brothers' reliability, would on the basis of royal wagons suddenly believe their inconceivable tale is hard to fathom. But perhaps the Abravanel would defend himself by saying that the wagons didn't completely convince Yaakov that Yosef was still alive, but they did give him hope. After all, we know from the ensuing meeting between Yaakov and Yosef that Yaakov didn't really believe that Yosef was alive until he saw him with his own eyes when he says, Amutar Pa'am, now I can die. Achari ra'oti et panecha, having seen your face, ki odcha chai, and knowing that you are still alive. So what Yaakov saw before he saw Yosef's face was merely a glimmer of hope, royal wagons that might mean that Yosef's dreams had come true. Maybe a sensible Egyptian treasurer had sent an escort for his sons, but now it was also possible that Yosef was that treasurer, that he had overcome every hurdle that had come his way and refused to allow the adversity to quash his faith. Maybe, just maybe, these wagons were the flicker of hope that he had been waiting for. It is true that Judge Allen Davis in Ohio state law would be unmoved by the sight of wagons. But since that lonely night on the side of the Yabok River, Yaakov has been dedicated to wresting a blessing from every encounter, and in the presence not of proof, but mere possibility, he allowed hope to define his faith and steer his life. May we all find ways to allow possibility to grow into hope, and hope to evolve into faith, and that faith to define our lives. I wish you all a Shavua Tov.